So I appreciate the opportunity to pick up the dialogue around the Syracuse Parking Authority. Just as a way of preamble, I've had, I think, this discussion with a couple folks on the council. I am personally not a huge fan of authorities, but in this case, I think it's actually
I also have a problem with authority, Frank. So we
yeah,
sympathize.
a,
I think Hogan
a,
too.
yeah, authority and authorities. Yes,
Parking authority.
yeah, that's right. But I know I know you share my concerns uh, about authorities in this context as well, Counselor. Um, but I think in this case, it's a strong possible solution to some concerns we have around parking in general and off-street parking specifically. It is not the only solution, and I want to be clear that the administration is not necessarily married to this solution, but it absolutely right now seems like the straightest path to getting where we need to get. So quickly, let me. Many of you know that there was a draft review by a consultant that was issued in January of 2019. We didn't ultimately agree with some of the work and a few of the conclusions, so the report remained in draft. But there's some really good work that was done. So just to give some context, the city's current off-street parking is 6 garages. Um, some of which we operate, some of which we lease out. 5 lots, same thing, some of which we operate, some of which we lease out. Total of about 5,000 spaces and $3.2 million in gross parking revenue. That does not include the revenue from long-term leases, like the lease with the downtown Marriott. Our on-street parking, just to add a little bit of context here, is about 1,900 spaces and about $2.5 million in gross revenue. One of the legitimate questions that you should ask is, what's our net revenue? And the answer is, that's one of the reasons that we need a parking authority, because I can't answer that question with the level of precision and accuracy that we ought to be able to.
Can you dive into that a little bit, Frank?
I will. Yeah.
Just for an amateur's view, I don't know if you get to it later in the presentation, but I was just going to ask, what prohibits you from having a clear picture?
Yeah, and it is later in the presentation, but if I don't answer it to your satisfaction, please let me know, Counselor, because it's something I can talk about forever.
No, that's good.
So what else did the consultant find for us? Off-street parking, there is significant deferred maintenance on the garages across the board, but some stick out more than others. AXA, for example, that we're faced with a $10.3 million, somewhere in that range, problem that we need to resolve. The city has an obligation to make those investments, and we haven't figured out a way to do it yet. We have deteriorating support systems throughout those garages. For example, the safety blue box systems are not working as well as they should be. In some cases, not working at all, and in most cases, the system is antiquated. The consultant found inconsistent management of the garages. We don't have a single provider of management services. We have had inconsistent results from management, and that can be the same manager from property to property. The oversight is lacking. I think our outside auditors while they haven't found any material weaknesses specific to parking, have pointed out to us on numerous occasions that anytime you have a remote payment site, it's a point of weakness, and we probably do not have the appropriate level of financial controls in place. They can't point to any specific loss or any specific risk, which is good, but there's a general feeling of discomfort. On, on the other side, we have lost revenue opportunities. We run these at very limited hours. There is always a demand at some of the garages for additional hours. We've been reluctant to make the kinds of investments that we need to make in order to make those garages in particular um, uh, generate more revenue. The garage at the gateway to the university, which is attached to the medical offices there. The folks at that office have asked a number of times for us to expand the hours. Syracuse Stage would like us to expand the hours of that particular garage, but doing so would require an investment in both the infrastructure and the people that run it. And it's difficult for us to calculate whether there would actually be a return on investment. One of the things that one of the first things the consultant recommended was an upgrade to the payment system. So to automate the payment system would allow us to accept cards, which we don't do now. It would allow us to expand the hours without expanding necessarily expanding the personnel related to running the garages. And it also helps with enforcement. Right now, the open lots for in particular, there is minimal enforcement of the of off-hour parking at those open lots. And to my way of thinking, just from what I can tell, I'm not convinced that there's tremendous enforcement uh, during regular hours there as well. Councilor Driscoll,
Frank,
do you, yep.
earlier, I'm sorry if I missed it, but earlier you gave the 6 garages, 5 lots, 5,000 spaces total. Do you know the breakdown of spaces for garages versus lots?
I do, but not. I don't have it right in front of me. Most of it is in garages, but I can't. I don't want to quote it off the top of my head.
Okay.
The lots are relatively small. I think the lots are less than 1,000, but of the 5,000, Counselor. But I will get you. I'll send you the chart.
Okay.
Um, Financial status is opaque. So, Counselor Driscoll, this goes to your question. There are, from what I can ascertain, a significant number of expenses that go into managing the garages that are not allocated against the garages. So essentially what I can tell you is um, how much revenue, how much gross revenue we bring in from each of the properties, and what we pay in direct expense, which is primarily the property management or the parking management, excuse me. Um, and if there is any large expenditure around a capital expense or capital improvement. But we have engineers that are going through these properties on a regular basis. We have, and those are both internal, our own engineers, and folks that we bring in from the outside as well. We have trades in and out of there to fix this or fix that. And there is, the financial system was never set up to allocate those expenses. We don't allocate expenses well in the city regardless, but we certainly do not do it against the garages. So it's very difficult for me. Right now we're working with the co-owners of the AXA garage. Those of you who know the convoluted status of ownership on that garage know that the city owns half of it, and the folks that own the towers own the other half of it. We're going through the process right now of working with them. They asked for a P&L statement on that garage, and what I was able to provide was not giving them the information that they needed or should have. And it's taking us a significant amount of time to crawl through the city's books and come up with a P&L. So that's about the best answer I can give you, Council Driscoll, is that the accounting system, unlike any that I have been used to, was never set up to allocate expenses across projects or across properties. It was set up to aggregate expense on a centralized basis, and it's very difficult to break it out, and it's tough to do here. Uh, Ultimately, the consultant recommended that we reestablish the parking authority, and combine all parking assets. And their clear conclusion was that off-street parking, particularly in the Northeast, but pretty much anywhere, but particularly in the Northeast, and these are folks who were pretty practiced in parking management, that there's virtually no way to make parking on scale, off-street parking, pay for itself. Um, it's particularly in a municipal setting that it's virtually impossible to do, and they could not provide us with any example where municipal ownership of multiple off-street parking is even break even, let alone driving revenue. So their suggestion was combine the on-street revenue and use at least some portion of on-street revenue to subsidize the investments that need to be made in off-street parking, and the losses associated. That's at this point in the city's quest for financial sustainability. Uh, the administration has strong concerns about our ability to do that. The parking revenue off street or on street in particular provides us with a significant revenue stream and cash flow, if nothing else. And moving that to an authority with no recourse to bring it back into the general fund is just not a preferred approach. What is a preferred approach, and what we'd like to open or continue the conversation about today, is to reestablish the authority, but to use the authority to house off-street parking. Um, we would put all of the garages and lots into the authority. We would hire a single comprehensive manager to run all of the off-street parking, and we would work with that manager to develop a comprehensive financial plan so that we have a full picture of what we're getting and what we're losing on the offsite parking. We'd use the authority to address the facility and infrastructure deficiencies. There's going to be some capital expense involved, and we understand that the authority would need the city as a backstop, but we would hope that that would be short term, and once it establishes its own financial track record, that it would be able to borrow and make the investments that it needs to make on its own. We'd also use the authority as the preferred method for disposing of non-performing garages and lots. So as we develop the financial plan, it may in fact be that there is one or two garages or lots that are actually revenue positive, and don't have a strategic reason for us to dispose of it. And so we would consider keeping those. But our general bias would be we shouldn't be in the garage business. We got into the garage business for good economic development reasons over time, but to the best of our ability, getting out of that business makes sense. We would consider at some point recommending moving on-street management so the parking management to these professionals, in order to maximize our revenue. We've talked at various times about a neighborhood parking program that requires some capital investment and requires some professional oversight as well. But at this point, I want to be careful that we would not be recommending moving the revenue from on-street parking for exclusive use of the authority, that it would need to be still returned to the general fund as much as possible. So that's pretty much where we are. We have approached our state delegation and started the process of reinvigorating the parking authority, but that requires this conversation and your feedback and questions and thoughts. And if we come up with a brilliant, better way to do this, we are absolutely open to that. This just seems to be the most straightforward way to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And with that, I will stop.
Right. So I think the first question I have is, if the garages are inherently not profitable, how would the authority be financially viable? Right. Like, if these garages are not going to be subsidized by on-street, how are they able to repay the bondholders and all the financial obligations they would have?
So they would only be able to borrow to the extent of its revenue, but the risk would be such that they would have to, that the city would have to backstop the debt. Wouldn't have to pay the debt, but the city would have to be willing to co-sign the debt, as it were.
So then what's the difference between doing all of these things in the authority versus just having the city make those changes?
The difference is the ease of decision making and the ease of bringing in the professional management, and the hope that we could very quickly, and I don't know, Counselor, how quickly, that we could get the authority standing on its own. We may find that, I don't believe this is true, but we could find that there's a ready market for all these facilities and the authority's out of business quickly. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think there's a lot of hoops that have to go through in order, for many of these facilities to be disposed of and to maximize the return to taxpayers. And we just think that a professional manager working inside the authority has a straighter line to doing that than we do, picking one at a time and trying to work our way through it. They can work on all of them simultaneously.
But couldn't we do a master RFP for all facilities from the city?
For the management of all the facilities, yes, we absolutely could do that, but that would not include the financial plan or the disposition of the assets. That would only be the management.
Now, Frank, is there a cost to obtaining the authority?
There's no cost to establishing the authority as such. There would be a cost to hiring the professional management team. Yes.
What's the expense on that? What's the
we would have to, the authority would have to do an RFP for it, and I'd be hesitant to put a number on that at this point, Counselor.
Counselor Green, can I add historic context here? Second. Frank, I don't know if you're aware of this, but probably you are. During the Driscoll administration, we created a parking authority, which we never actually put into effect, but it was actually given state authorization to create a parking authority. I don't know if that needs to just be revisited or if law says you have to redo it, but we did ask the state of New York, and we're given the authority to create a parking authority. The purpose of that at that time was to, before we transferred the airport over to an authority, was to put all the garages, including the airport garage that was bonded for by the city taxpayers, into the authority. Because as you know, the airport garage is a goose that lays the golden egg, and that garage makes about $2 million a year in profit. So we just didn't act on it before we transferred the airport. But the other thing to consider historically is that the city gave up the zoo, the ballpark, the sewer mains, and everything to the county as the tax base shift to the suburbs. as you pointed out, these garages are lost leaders for economic development. I don't understand why the MDA or now the Center State CEO or the county doesn't handle parking authorities for the city, because we built the Fayette garage because Lone Park Place insisted on that garage being built in order to develop downtown. Other garages, the Sibley's garage was built for Sibley's. So they were all put in a time the city could afford to fund these garages, and now we can't. And it really should be a tax base that goes to the county, not the city, that funds these economic development tools, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that historical context is helpful. I think that there's a couple perspectives on why the authority was abandoned, and I think the airport transfer, the move of Excellus to the suburbs, was part of it. I think the authority, the timing of the original chartering of the authority seems to coincide with the city's negotiations to keep Excellus downtown, where parking seemed to, some folks thought, was the silver bullet. But to your original question, Clerk Capanis, the authority has technically expired, but recently enough that it can be revived. So it's on kind of, the existing authority is kind of on life support, and the legislation that would be introduced would be to reestablish the existing authority, the one you referenced, for a period of 15 years, which was the 15 years was the original life of the authority.
Can I jump in there, Councilor Green? That was passed in 2003, and it's 15 years. You're right, Frank. Was 2018 would have been the normal existence of that, if I recall from my days on the council. So when you say it can be resurrected relatively easily, is it in the same context as the original authority documentation, legislation rather, excuse me?
Yeah, there's a couple minor changes that Assemblyman Magnarelli's office asked for that aligned it with, and they were really technical changes that, and I'd be happy to provide those. Small wording changes that aligned the revitalizing legislation with some legislation that recently passed, I think, for Buffalo. But in general, Auditor Maroon, it is basically the exact same thing.
And if I may, while I'm here, or while I'm on, so you talked about potential disposition of the garages and the parking overall. Is that in line with something that you'd want to see happen relatively quickly? And I say that in the context because we're moving so rapidly as a country into autonomous vehicles that parking garages probably will be moot or mitigated or just not necessary long term.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it's a great reason for us to get out of it. We have a garage that there's interest in right now, and because someone owns an adjacent piece of property and thinks it might fit. We have interest in an open lot, off-street parking, because it's adjacent to another property and might be a fit. So that's the upside. On the downside, we've got one of our what I would call jewels in the crown, if you can call any of the six a jewel, that will be coming back to ownership of the city, that looks like it should be the winner among the group, but has got some deferred investment that is going to offset any of the the freewheeling revenue, and then we have the looming problem with access. So speed is absolutely of the essence. The problem is every one of these properties has deficiencies that need to be addressed, whether those are physical deficiencies, whether those are use codicils or ownership, oddities in the way that they're owned. So it's just physically going to take time and expertise to work through this.
Thank you, Councilor.
Frank, so in terms of the question about cost and the current situation, which we're not necessarily tracking costs accurately. So, I mean, we're talking about a situation where maybe there's something that needs a minor repair, and we send one of our guys over there to spend 6 hours and use a little materials, and then we're not necessarily tracking that to a particular garage. Is that like an example of something that would be a situation?
Yeah, I think it's larger than that. I think we've done I think we've made investments in these in certain properties that has just never been tracked, and on a larger scale than somebody just going over and patching up a pothole in one of the ramps. I think that there has been some significant electrical work that's been done over the years, some concrete and rebar work that's been done over the years. Just what you need to put into the dollars you need to put into one of these structures to keep them going in the Northeast that we don't have any record of having happened. Some of it is it didn't happen, but some of it is we must have done it and paid for it and never tracked it.
So I guess my question is, in a scenario where there is some kind of small repair needed or bigger repair, and would parking authority utilize existing city workforce and then build back that, or would they just not use it at all? And then we're kind of creating inefficiencies because we have city staff not, maybe that has extra bandwidth and the parking authority needs work done and we're not able to match them up this way.
I think it's a point taken. I think that the authority will do whatever is the most efficient and most effective for the garages. It'll have a fiduciary responsibility to manage the assets to best advantage. And if using additional capacity that the city can provide meets that fiduciary standard, then they would be able to do that. But again, it would need to be, in order to maintain the appropriate accounting, it would need to be fully tracked and transparent as opposed to the way we're doing it now.
Frank, I just want to point out something that Councilor Green is getting at. Do we have any outstanding bond issues on these garages? Because bonding is what we used to do for significant repairs on any of the garages we own.
Yeah.
So are we paying bond debt? And the second question part of it is, if you created the authority, we could bill it like we do the water department or the airport. If you took in the parking revenue from the street, you could bill back like we bill the water department for support services of the city, and gain revenue from that and keep it all in one place and have that money there. And depending on how much you wanted to bill, along what Councilor Green is saying, the little costs or the larger costs would determine what we take out of there in revenue if it was all in an authority.
Yep, both of those are absolutely the case, and moving the management, but whether they do the collections and then pay us for the assets, or whether we bill them for some other reason, there's no question that would be ultimately where we want to get. My concern is not the reason that I would not suggest moving the on-street management immediately is that if the authority is successful and gets us out of off-street parking quickly, we then have to go through the effort of dissolving the authority and moving on-street back to the city. So I would like to get a little bit of experience under our feet before we did that. But that said, I think the strategy that you outlined is exactly the right one if we're going to be in the parking business for any length of time.
So I know this is dependent a lot on timing, but I guess what's a sample of the timeline in a scenario where the council move forward on this?
So the assemblyman's office is looking to know that the council is in support of it, and so we need to work out making the timeline relatively quick. They're not sure when they can get it on the agenda in Albany, but they'd like to know that they have all of the ducks in a row in Syracuse. So we need to work with you to get this on your agenda relatively quickly so that we can meet the timeline that.
I don't understand. We go from it sounds like 0 to 100. Like what? What exactly you're saying? What exactly would it say that would come quickly?
The council needs to agree, the common council needs to agree.
Frank, can I just explain the
Sure.
process? You have to
Yep.
do a memorializing resolution to the state, but they don't go into session until January. So I'm not so sure what the hurry is, but they go in session in January. They're off till then. And then they have to put a bill in. I assume Assemblyman Magarelli wants the bill sooner than later, but you have really till January, in my opinion, to get a memorializing resolution to the state.
Absolutely. But to your point, Assemblyman Magnarelli would like it sooner rather than later.
Frank, oh, go on, Tim.
I was just thinking, my gut is that the garages are the main issue. The surface lots seem, they're like our land bank, so to speak. They're like our valuable land that we have for development in the future that we can just hold and sell off over time without much fear of maintenance. And then when you say off-street parking, and you like that's, well, off street's the garages, and then there's the street. I just think the garages are the issue. I wouldn't want to. I personally don't think I'd want to loop in all the surface lots. I feel like the surface lots you could almost do with a similar strategy as on-street parking, in terms of like monitoring and all of that. But and you could sell them off over time just for cash money. But I guess the big picture is I think it's like a huge exercise in math. And we have too few people doing math. So like it needs numbers like for each garage, and then in theory each lot, and then kind of like what it would look like to borrow to fix it, what it would look like to operate it properly. I mean, it's the same exercise that the private people would have to do, but it seems like we should have some capacity to do that. Because otherwise we don't even know what's a good deal. Like we don't have the capacity to do it at all. We don't have the capacity to know whether we're getting a good deal. We're just like, let's tie them all together and hope we don't make a bad deal.
Yeah, I don't disagree in principle, Counselor. I think what I'm suggesting is that math would be done inside the authority, and that the authority would look at each individual property, but also at a master plan. The lots, some of those lots are not buildable, and some of the lots are used by the city. The lot across the street from City Hall, obviously. The one that's up against One Lincoln Center is to my knowledge not buildable. It could be. Eric, I think I saw that you were on. You might know that better than I. But that would have more value as parking for the folks that own One Lincoln Center. We would need to do an analysis on the authority would need to do an analysis on whether it makes sense to hold or sell that particular one. So of the 6, I'm not sure which ones would have market value other than to their neighbor. Pearl Street, for example, up against, would somebody want to build on Pearl Street up against 81, where we have, 125 spaces?
Frank, at the same time, they seem so fundamentally different than the garages. Like they're so much easier to maintain and so much easier to operate. You can just
Point taken. No capital requirement, but there's no parking enforcement. There's minimal parking enforcement. I don't want to say there's none. There's minimal parking enforcement, which is one of the things the consultant said that we're losing a ton of revenue on.
As Councilor Green and Rod had pointed out about the garages and the lots, one of the reasons, Frank, that this authority was created was along Blue Cross Blue Shield, the airport, and also to try to get the county or the MDA to support parking that should be partners with us, because you cannot use a declining tax base in the city to support these lost leaders. These are lost leaders. And nobody in the private sector is going to buy our losers because they have to pay property tax on it that we don't pay. So they have an additional cost. So unless you own a garage right next to a medical office or the airport where you can make money off the garage because you have a captive audience, you're going to have a lost leader, and there's going to be taxes have to be paid by a private industry that buys these garages that we don't pay or the authority won't pay. So the whole idea is to try to get more people that have a bigger tax base involved with underwriting this operation. And I think the county should be approached on this before you finalize a plan.
Frank, when was the survey done anyways?
The consultant issued their draft in January of 2019.
Frank, how many people are, where do the people across the street from City Hall park, you know? The people in the old telephone building, the old apartments, where are they all gonna park when that's filled?
There's some
Frank.
part. Yep.
Oh, Frank, I can just add a little
Yeah,
bit with
please,
interjecting.
Eric, go ahead.
So Eric on us here, just adding in. So, Counselor, the as a part of the 9X redevelopment, there will be some ground level parking incorporated with that project that traditionally was not a part of that building in the past. So I know they're adding inside the facility. There will be some parking access, and then they do have some land, some parking included on their property that they own next door to the to where city employees are parking. So they've factored some of that into to their tenant base as they solicit and recruit new residential tenants.
So, I mean, so they're all taken care of? They're not gonna be parking in any of the garages downtown?
I don't know the answer to that for sure. I know that having the parking on site is clearly going to be the highest amenity. If residents, if those fill up, residents could have the opportunity to look elsewhere. But I don't know for sure if they feel they're all set. But I just know that they will have some on-site parking available, more than what the building has had in the past.
I'm just saying, as part of this survey, was the potential growth in downtown residents factored into that too, or not?
It's a really important point, Counselor, and it's one of the deficiencies I found in the report is that it was less of a market potential. There really was minimal, and it wasn't what the consultant was charged with, but it was much more focused on operating costs and current revenues than it was on market potential. It's
Because
an important
because
point.
to your point, a lot of the surrounding neighborhoods in this around downtown, I'm particularly thinking of the Park Avenue neighborhood. A lot of folks that work downtown park in that neighborhood. They avoid the garages downtown. Now I don't know. Obviously, they don't want to pay, but I think there's some potential, and I'm just really confused on the finances here. I mean, to the city clerk's point, we have general obligation bonds, I believe, out for the air. Not, I keep on saying the airport, but the parking garages, and transferring all those assets and the bonding authority over to the parking authority. I'm not sure where we're gaining here at all. I don't understand it.
Yeah, so I think to Councilor Green's point, Councilor Hogan, we could do this in the city. We could absolutely duplicate what the authority can do. I question whether we can do it quickly and comprehensively for all of the structures simultaneously. We can do it one by one, but I'll be honest with you, just getting through AXA, we've been talking about the disposition of AXA since it's well over a year, and we are no closer to finishing that up than we probably were a year ago. Now there's some built-in complications to that, but take something that's relatively more straightforward, like the interest that's been put in the open lot up against Lincoln Center. We've got at least one interested buyer. It takes the time and the expertise for us to work our way through the necessary and good bureaucracy of marketing that and clearing the way to market that piece of property. It takes too long, and we don't have the time or the expertise to do all of these properties simultaneously.
So we're transferring it to this parking authority to actually divest ourselves and the authority of the assets,
to do
correct?
both things, to do the analysis that Counselor Rudd suggests, and ultimately to do either a plan for retention or a plan for disposition. And to the clerk's point, if that disposition is another municipality that's interested, you know, I think right now that there is a market for at least four, or there's a disposition strategy for at least four of the properties into the private market, if we can get past some of the hurdles that are inherent to them, because they complement the financial intentions of a developer that has interest in adjacent properties or aligned interests. So that's four of the six.
So we basically diminish the ability of our economic development folks and the city to offer any kind of parking incentives for any but kind of business that wants to relocate downtown, like another Access Towers or something, a large outfit that wants to come downtown. If we, I mean, we won't have any control except who's going to appoint the parking authority people, the mayor or the common council on the
It is,
board.
yeah, I've not seen the legislation. I can't, I'll find that answer for you. It's in the legislation, the proposed legislation, Counselor. I don't know off the top of my head.
Pretty sure it's the mayor.
Yeah.
Who's that, Councilor Green? The mayor appoints
I'm
everybody
pretty
on the
sure it's the
authority?
I think
mayor.
it is current. I think the original was the mayor. I'm not sure if it is in the revised. That's the reason I'm waffling on that. I'm not sure if that stayed in the revision, but I believe it probably did. I don't know, Eric, can you speak to the efficacy of having ownership of these garages in economic development activities?
Sure. I think, from the perspective that we've been discussing, if it is in close proximity to an existing facility where it is advantageous for that property owner or developer to take advantage of it, we do believe that there is a market and there is some interest there. I think the lots were also referred to. I think that, that for downtown especially, if there's an ability to develop on some of the lots, if we think that there's an interest there and we think it's beneficial to the city and our tax base, of course, I think that's something that we collectively would be willing to consider. But it's assessing each one of these facilities and each one of these properties. When we are looking at a disposition strategy, we would look at what's the best route forward. Is it putting it out to bid so that we have multiple bidders? We have a solicitation process so that we consider any number of redevelopment uses. And then what is their sustainability plan? And I think that directly factors into economic development and what the future of these assets look like if they're not going to be maintained by the city anymore.
Do we have a projected amount, yearly cost of these, of this whole, of all the garages? Do we have a projected yearly cost? We don't, do we? Of how much they cost us every single year, or what they might cost us every single year? I'm just worrying about the timing of this thing during COVID. We don't know how we're going to come out of this COVID thing. So,
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and we could find. I mean, right now there's not been a huge drop off, Counselor, in our monthly Parker contracts. There's been some, but as downtown offices go to their recovery plans, we have real concern about whether we're going to be on the losing end of the monthly parking equation. There, as you pointed out, there's already a lot of folks who avoid the facilities, and there could be more if in fact the shift to remote work happens. That's under question right now. There's a lot of folks saying the shift to remote work was overstated and is not going to happen, and that will bring the demand for the garages back. I think the general the general premise here is the assumption, and it is an assumption, but it's the assumption, and I think it's borne out in both the consultant study and in any of our sister cities, that municipal parking programs by and large aren't self-sustaining. They need to be subsidized. To the clerk's point, are you subsidizing them with on-street parking, which is more sustainable? Are you subsidizing them with the tax base? They're not going to be self-sustaining. And it's not something that I think Syracuse is in a position, financial position to continue. So whether we use a parking authority to do that analysis and have speed to disposition, or whether we do it in-house, I think the end result is going to be the same. It's going to be disposition of as many of these as we can.
How much did we pay for the study?
Don't know the answer to that question.
We
Councilman
didn't
Leonard.
pay for it. It was through, Eric, I think it was through CIDA, right? The city,
Try to pay for it.
that I don't know.
Yeah. I
We didn't pay for it.
don't have the number off the top of my head, Counselor, but that is correct that CIDA did encumber the cost of the study.
I would just say I think that the study is like an example of why some of these studies are like delay tactics more than anything, because like we get that things don't always work and we have to make tough decisions, but then if we're not going to make the tough decisions, we don't need the study because the study tells us what we already know. So like all these other issues where we punt to have a study, like I just think don't pay for it, just start making decisions that we have
So
to
what's the tough decision in your mind then? To just sell them?
Well, you have to do math. You have to sit there. You have to say, look, there's 6 garages. You use, like, people use AXA as an anecdote to undermine the viability of the other 5. But AXA is a unique cluster because it's a parking garage that we own a 50% interest that has a building above it. So, like, that's so unique. It needs like an asterisk in its own category. I don't even know that you would put it in a parking authority because it's so weird. Like, it has implications for the rest of the building, which is a regional tower. You know, so like that one, of course it's a headache, but that one's different. And then the other garages, yeah, maybe there's a case to be had about selling certain ones. Maybe there's a case to just invest in technology that allows us to operate them more with less staffing, and then to have strategic enforcement across them. Maybe there's lots that we could sell, but each of the 11 assets require a level of detail that we don't currently have here. And then it takes, and the numbers associated with the properties should help lead to conclusions about what the appropriate path. Can we sell it? Do we hold it for longer term value? Do we make strategic investments in it to increase the revenue in the near term? Do we, anything else? I don't know. It would depend on what you see, right? Like there's not any comparison, like the beginning, 5,000 spaces, 3.2 million revenue. That's the off-street. The on-street parking, 1,900 spaces, 2.5 million revenue. There's the layers, so then it becomes what's the revenue per spot? What's the revenue per spot in the lots, in each of the 5 lots? How does it vary? What's the revenue in the 6 garages? How does it vary? What's the history behind any unique agreements? For instance, Councilor Hogan highlighted that we use these as economic development incentives to attract large employers to the area. So which garages have like low rates because we've made deals to attract people to come and buy lunch in the city? Like there's none of that I could see at the moment, but all of that is stuff that we could and should do in order, and no one else is going to do it for us.
Well, so I agree with absolutely everything you said, Counselor, except that last sentence. There is no question that that's precisely what needs to be done on each of these properties. But there's also no question that we have neither the bandwidth nor the expertise to do it, because everything that you just laid out is 100% correct, but it's important but not sufficient. So parking is a unique animal, and these parking structures are unique animals. So and they are exceedingly capital intensive, particularly in the Northeast. So there is an expertise to understanding the just the way the finances flow. So the difference between there's a point of inflection between how much monthly parking is good and how much transient parking is good. You don't want too much monthly and you don't want too much transient. I know enough to know that. I have no idea how to find the balance between the two. It takes expertise to understand that. So, and to do it, and it takes experience. And that's what we're suggesting we would do with the authority. Could we hire a professional manager within the city to do this? Absolutely. Is it going to ask them to operate with one hand tied behind their back? Because in order to implement any of their management decisions, it would take going through the city bureaucracy and conceivably multiple returns to the council? Absolutely. So I go back to my beginning remarks. This is not the only solution. In my mind, it is the most straightforward way to get to exactly what you described, a financial analysis of each of the structures individually and collectively, and a plan for either managing them or disposing of them appropriately.
And Frank, that would all be predicated on their ability to bond. You remove every asset and all those valuable assets first from the parking authority. It affects their ability to bond for the rest of the garages, correct?
Absolutely. No question.
So I mean, I think it's sort of there's just a ton of questions regarding all this. I mean, even with when we created the airport authority, I believe the airport authority, maybe the city clerk can bear this out. The airport authority to bond over $10 million, they still have to come to the council, or maybe they got rid of that since I left the council. I don't know. But I mean, I just don't see where we get off the hook this easy as far as the bonding goes.
I would add that I do think authorities undermine democracy, right? Because you elect people, the elected people. Like, I personally think it's easier to reach out to a commissioner and ask for something than it is to reach out to the person who's hired by the independent board, and then you have to reach out to your board member to convince them that this is the right thing, to then convince the other board members, to then convince the person that they only have the power to hire and fire. Like, I just don't. It definitely subverts the will, but the problem is when there's a lack of will, it becomes like, oh, well, we don't know what to do with this, so let's just give it to someone else.
Yeah, I don't. So you could characterize it as a lack of will. I prefer to characterize it as a lack of bandwidth and expertise.
Frank, so I think the process you laid out, which is that kind of step one would be to transfer the garages, and then kind of the first thing the parking authority would do is evaluate them based individually and collectively. I mean, that does give me some pause. I mean, my preference would be for us to know that before we transfer it, because I mean, in a scenario where, you know, they calculate the NOI and the future capital needs, and it turns out that they're valuable, and like, I would feel uncomfortable as a counselor having given away $12 million worth of assets, but then collect the other side too, is that if it turns out they're all liabilities and that they're never going to work, then I feel like we've created this authority that's destined to fail, because it turns out they're never going to be able to make it work. So I just feel like from a process standpoint, it seems like it's something we would want to know the value of them before we transfer them to the authority.
Yeah, and again, we would, in order to do that, Councilor Green, and we certainly can take that route. My suggestion is that route is going to be longer and ultimately probably at least as expensive and conceivably more expensive. So hiring somebody to do that kind of analysis and comprehensive financial plan at the same time as managing the assets and looking to move it quickly inside the city. I apologize. I have low expectations for our ability to pull that off, as opposed to putting it into a single place, having full financial transparency, and structuring it. You know, do we want to structure it in a way that the council has full view of what happens to those assets? Absolutely. Do you want to be able to claw back those assets? Sure. All of that can be addressed in the way in my mind, in the way the assets are transferred into the authority. And each one of those is going to be an individual, in general, going to be an individual case as well, because each of them are owned currently under much less than optimum structures.
Councilor Green, in a follow-up to your point, Frank, obviously the people who did this study, which I'm a little concerned that you decided not to have them finalize their recommendations, obviously saw that on-street parking was the only way to underwrite the garages. That's what their conclusion was. The only way you're going to underwrite it is if you have an asset that creates real revenue. It doesn't have any costs involved, with significant cost involved with it. So why wouldn't you have this group finish the report to reach the answers that Councilor Green is asking?
Well, the scope of the report was never to do that, unfortunately. The scope of the report, and it wasn't, and I will defer to the folks that actually proposed to have the report done. That was not the scope of the report. We could go back. These folks have the expertise to do it. They, in fact, do this for multiple municipalities, and certainly have the expertise. But that was not the scope of the original report.
Who are they, Frank?
It's a group that, and Eric, you may remember, it's a group that NBD sub-hired, so that was done through NBD. And Eric, do you remember the name of the parking consultants NBD used?
I believe it was ABM Parking. I don't know what the acronym actually stands for, but it is a nationwide organization that has done this in communities, both in the Northeast, but throughout the country. A partner organization that we work closely with is the National Development Council, or the NDC. We've had a longstanding relationship with them on economic development matters. They were directly referred to us by NDC as a partner, again, somebody that has expertise doing these types of reports and studies. And NDC assisted us with building that scope of work when the study was first issued. But from my understanding, I believe it was ABM that had completed the report itself.
So that was an RFP through the council, or that was a CITA deal?
It was through CITA, through CITA's procurement abilities.
Can I ask a question, Councilor Green? Frank or Eric, maybe you can answer this. I believe when the mayor was in your position, Eric, this same group, the NDC and ABM, did a study of the garages 8 years ago. Let's see, 2020. So it'd have to be somewhere in the vicinity of 2012, maybe 14. Was there a study? They did it. I know they did it. I just don't remember when it was done.
So, Auditor, I would have to go back then and dig through files around that time, and that was before I started with the city of Syracuse itself. However, I will look into that if you have a recollection of a prior report that was completed. This study directly by ABM is the only one that I was aware of.
You could ask the mayor. He came to the council asking to go ahead and do the study when he was in your position. He would certainly remember it because he was involved with the group. And I believe Center State had advised him of that group, the NDC back then, and then they did proceed with a study. So I believe there was one done. I just don't remember exactly when. And I believe it was by the same group.
Okay. All right. Thank you for the information.
Okay.
Be helpful
We're
to
coming
know.
up in an hour. So any last questions from any of the councilors? Okay. Frank, anything in closing?
Can you do the basic stuff that I was asking about, the 11 assets, the 6 garage, the breakdown spots per garage, revenue per garage? Can you do that?
Yep, I can send you the chart that was in that the folks put together inside the study. That has draft marked all over it, Council.
I'd like to see that too. And there's no cost there though, right? Correct, Frank? Cost per garage?
There's minimal expense information. Nothing that even approximates a true P&L, which is concerning.
I'm going to wait for my autonomous car from Nader at some point.
Yeah, you know what's interesting now, Counselor, and Eric knows this better than any of us, but most financing deals on new parking structures actually now require that they be designed and engineered for alternate use, or you can't get the financing. I would love to get out of the way of the garage business before our structures that were built well before those kinds of requirements become obsolete.
Or, yeah.
All right, well, with that, thank you all. We'll close the hearing.
Thank you.